History tells us Rome was a master of conquest. Yet in its endless pursuit of power, the empire committed a mistake so ironic it feels almost unreal. In their hunger for dominance, the Romans shared their secrets of warfare, tactics, and discipline, with those they called barbarians. But these lessons did not vanish into the dust of the training fields. They were remembered, sharpened, and eventually turned back against Rome itself. From Germanic warriors to Gothic kings, the very peoples Rome sought to subdue became students in the art of Roman warfare. And when the time came, these students rose as enemies. Rome's armies were legendary for their discipline, organization, and relentless drive for conquest. But what made them truly formidable was their ability to adapt and expand by drawing from the very people they conquered. From the earliest days of the Republic and later under the Empire, Rome knew it could not rely solely on its own citizens to maintain control over such vast territories. The answer lay in integration. Foreign soldiers, men from Gaul, Iberia, Thrace, North Africa, and beyond, were recruited into Rome's legions as auxiliaries. They were offered incentives that were both practical and enticing: steady pay, the chance for plunder, and perhaps most importantly, the promise of Roman citizenship after years of service. For men born outside the empire, this was not just an opportunity to fight, but a chance to elevate their families into Rome's world, to gain rights and privileges previously denied to them. This system made Rome's armies larger, stronger, and more diverse than any other force of its time. Yet what Rome was giving away was not only citizenship, but also knowledge. Knowledge that had been forged through centuries of discipline, strategy, and hard-earned battlefield experience. These foreign recruits were not merely auxiliaries left to fight in their own ways. They were trained to fight as Romans. They learned to march in step, to maintain strict formations, to build and defend fortifications, and to follow the commands of officers with unquestioned discipline. In doing so, they were being reshaped from independent warriors into soldiers of one of history's most efficient war machines. And in the process, Rome was creating something that could not easily be undone: the spreading of Roman military science far beyond the boundaries of the empire itself. At first, the benefits seemed overwhelming. Rome expanded rapidly, and its legions became nearly unstoppable. Enemies who once fought as scattered tribes were crushed by this new model of integrated warfare. Entire regions were pacified, their young men funneled into Rome's armies, where they served alongside Romans, bled for the empire, and returned home with the scars and stories of campaigns that stretched from Britain to the deserts of the Middle East. To Roman leaders, this seemed like the perfect solution: endless manpower, loyal soldiers, and a steady supply of recruits from the lands they had conquered. But beneath the surface, there was danger that few recognized. These men were not blank slates. They were members of tribes and nations with their own traditions, loyalties, and ambitions. While many came to respect Rome, they never forgot where they came from. When they marched back into their homelands after service, they brought more than memories of Rome's discipline. They brought expertise. They taught others how to fight in organized ranks, how to build siege weapons, how to resist Roman cavalry, and how to exploit the weaknesses of legionary formations. Even those who stayed within Rome's borders sometimes carried divided loyalties, torn between their service to the empire and their bond to their people. The genius of Rome's military system was also its greatest vulnerability. By welcoming outsiders into its ranks, Rome multiplied its strength in the short term, but planted the seeds of future resistance. The very skills that had once been Rome's secret advantage were now in the hands of men who might one day turn against it. Every auxiliary trained in Roman discipline was, in effect, a walking vessel of Rome's knowledge, a vessel that could not be contained once released. Over generations, this pattern repeated itself. Tribes that had once fallen easily to Rome became harder to subdue, and new enemies appeared not as chaotic raiders but as organized, disciplined forces capable of challenging Rome on equal footing. What Rome never seemed to fully understand was that knowledge once given could not be taken back. Its system of integration, designed to strengthen the empire, had the unintended consequence of strengthening its enemies. And while it worked for centuries, the cracks began to show as those trained under Roman command started to use their skills for their own purposes. In time, the empire's reliance on outsiders would tip from strength into fatal weakness, as Rome discovered that it had not only trained soldiers, it had trained its future destroyers. The Roman military machine thrived on discipline, order, and efficiency. These were the qualities that set it apart from the fractured tribes and kingdoms it faced. But discipline alone could not explain Rome's rise. What truly gave Rome the edge was its ability to absorb, adapt, and refine the very tools of its enemies. Time and again, Rome encountered warriors with tactics and weapons it had never seen before, and rather than dismiss them, it studied them closely, learned from them, and often improved upon what it discovered. This willingness to adopt foreign methods was not a weakness but a strength, allowing Rome to evolve into a power that could face nearly any opponent. Yet there was a hidden danger in this process, for in copying and teaching these methods, Rome was also ensuring that such knowledge would not remain its own secret forever. One of the clearest examples came from the Gauls, fierce warriors who terrified Rome in its early years. In 390 BC, the Gauls even sacked Rome itself, a wound that left deep scars in the Roman psyche. The Romans learned a painful lesson. Brute courage alone could not match disciplined force, but neither could rigid discipline defeat sheer ferocity without adaptation. Over time, Rome adopted elements of Gallic weaponry, including the longsword, which would later influence Roman designs. The curved Gallic shield inspired changes in Roman equipment, and techniques once used against Rome were soon being wielded by its legions with devastating effect. In adopting the strengths of the Gauls, Rome not only defeated them but also created an army that carried the Gauls' own legacy forward. The same happened in Spain during Rome's wars with the Iberians. The Iberians carried a short double-edged sword, the gladius, that proved deadly in close combat. The Romans quickly realized its superiority over their own weapons, and within years the gladius became the iconic weapon of the Roman legionary, synonymous with Rome's power itself. What began as a foreign tool became a symbol of Roman might, a weapon that conquered empires. But in that transformation lay a hidden irony. The Iberians had given Rome the very blade that would carve their lands into Roman provinces. And centuries later, those same lands would remember how to wield such weapons when rebellion stirred. From the east came new challenges. The Greeks and Macedonians had pioneered the phalanx, a wall of spears that had dominated the ancient world. Rome at first struggled against this formation, as seen in battles against Pyrrhus of Epirus. Yet Rome's flexible manipular system eventually outmaneuvered the rigid phalanx. Still, the Romans were quick to take from their Greek opponents what worked: siege technologies, engineering designs, and even naval tactics. By the time Rome fought against Carthage, it was building warships modeled directly on those of its enemies, equipping them with improvements such as the Corvus boarding device to turn sea battles into infantry fights, something the Romans excelled at. Here again, Rome's genius lay not in invention but in adaptation. Even the feared horsemen of the steppes contributed to Rome's growth. Confronted with Parthian cavalry, especially the deadly horse archers, Rome realized the limits of its heavy infantry when caught in open terrain. The Parthians' famous victory at Carrhae in 53 BC, where Roman legions were humiliated, drove home the point that cavalry could dominate under the right conditions. Rome responded by increasing the role of cavalry in its forces, often drawing recruits from provinces such as Gaul and Numidia, where horsemanship was a way of life. The empire's reliance on foreign cavalry would grow steadily, and these riders brought with them not only skills but also their own traditions of war, traditions that they carried home long after their service ended. This process repeated again and again. Rome conquered, observed, borrowed, and absorbed. To its enemies, this made Rome almost unstoppable, a force that seemed to grow stronger with every defeat it suffered. But what Rome did not always realize was that this cycle was a two-way exchange. Every Iberian trained in Roman ranks, every Gallic cavalryman serving under a Roman eagle, every auxiliary learning siegecraft was also becoming a vessel of Roman knowledge. Over time, these men passed their learning to their own people, blending Roman tactics with native traditions. The brilliance of Roman adaptation was that it made Rome powerful. The danger of Roman adaptation was that it made the world powerful too. In its hunger to perfect its armies, Rome unwittingly armed the future with the very tools that would one day break the empire apart. It was not just weapons or tactics Rome was giving away. It was a blueprint for empire itself, one that others would eventually use against the empire that had once taught them. Rome's decision to integrate foreign warriors into its armies may have looked like a brilliant strategy on the surface, but beneath it lay a problem that would quietly grow into one of the empire's greatest weaknesses: loyalty. The auxiliaries, those non-citizen soldiers drawn from conquered or allied lands, were essential to Rome's ability to maintain such vast territories. They filled the ranks that native Romans alone could not sustain, providing archers from the east, cavalry from the north, and fierce fighters from the provinces. They were rewarded with pay, a share of spoils, and, after 25 years of service, the promise of Roman citizenship. For many, this was enough to ensure bravery on the battlefield. But citizenship was a distant prize, and loyalty to Rome was not always absolute. For every auxiliary who embraced Roman values, there was another who remained tied to his homeland, his tribe, and his people's ambitions. Auxiliaries often carried with them traditions and identities that Rome could not erase. A Thracian horseman might ride under a Roman banner, but his heart still beat with the songs and legends of his ancestors. An archer from Syria might fight Rome's enemies, but he still spoke his native tongue, prayed to his own gods, and kept alive the customs of his land. Service in Rome's army did not erase these ties. It merely placed them in temporary silence. When the campaigns ended and soldiers returned home, sometimes with weapons, training, and newfound confidence, they often became powerful figures among their own people. They were men who had learned Rome's ways, and while some used this knowledge to remain loyal allies, others saw it as a gift of power to be turned against the empire. The problem was not simply with auxiliaries who returned home, but also with those who stayed within Rome's armies. Divided loyalties could appear on the battlefield itself. In times of crisis, when rebellion broke out in their homelands, auxiliaries were sometimes asked to march against their own kin. In such moments, Rome's commanders could not always be sure of their reliability. Would they fight with full conviction against their own people? Or would hesitation, even quiet sabotage, creep into the ranks? History offers examples of both loyalty and betrayal, but the uncertainty alone was enough to make auxiliaries both an asset and a potential liability. This uncertainty deepened as Rome expanded further and became increasingly dependent on foreign recruits. By the late empire, the number of non-Romans in the army often outnumbered citizens. Whole units were formed of men who shared the same tribal or ethnic background, serving under Roman officers but retaining their native identities. Such formations were effective in combat, but they also created pockets of unity within the Roman army that did not necessarily align with loyalty to the empire. A commander who could sway such men might suddenly command not only their service, but also their allegiance, shifting power away from Rome and toward individual generals or even rebellious leaders. One of the greatest dangers lay in what auxiliaries carried with them when they left Roman service. After decades in the legions, they returned to their homelands with an education few outsiders could match. They knew how to build roads and fortifications, how to use discipline to keep men in order, how to wield weapons effectively, and how to organize armies in ways that could rival Rome itself. A man who had once been just another warrior in a tribal band might come back as a seasoned veteran capable of training hundreds. These veterans often became leaders of resistance when tensions flared, and their knowledge made rebellions far more dangerous than in earlier centuries. Even those who remained loyal while in Rome's service sometimes left behind descendants who did not feel the same bonds. Citizenship, once granted, gave families a permanent place in Roman society, but it also spread Roman military knowledge into bloodlines that stretched far beyond Italy. The empire, in its attempt to secure loyalty through rewards, ended up dispersing the very tools of its power into lands where loyalty was always fragile. Rome believed that auxiliaries were a solution to its manpower needs, but in truth, they were also a reminder of Rome's growing reliance on outsiders. The more the empire leaned on them, the less it could depend on the old core of citizen soldiers who had once defined the Republic's strength. By building an army with such mixed loyalties, Rome was laying the groundwork for future instability. For while auxiliaries gave Rome strength in the short term, they also carried with them seeds of division, uncertainty, and rebellion, seeds that, in time, would grow into some of the greatest threats the empire ever faced. When Rome expanded across Europe, Africa, and the East, it encountered enemies who fought with ferocity and cunning, forcing the empire to adapt. But what Rome often failed to realize was that in these struggles, its foes were learning just as much from Rome as Rome was from them. Every battle fought was not only a clash of swords, but also an exchange of knowledge. For enemies who survived the weight of Rome's legions, the lessons learned on the battlefield became stepping stones toward mastering Roman methods themselves. This transfer of knowledge was not immediate, nor was it always intentional, but over centuries it reshaped the very world Rome had once dominated. Consider the Germanic tribes. At first, they seemed scattered and disorganized, a collection of warriors fighting for personal glory rather than coordinated strategy. To the Romans, this made them dangerous but manageable, so long as Rome could bring discipline and formation to the fight. Yet repeated contact with Rome slowly changed the Germanic way of war. Captured tribesmen who were enslaved, recruited, or who simply fought alongside Rome as auxiliaries brought back new ways of fighting. They learned the importance of discipline, of maintaining cohesion, of using combined arms instead of charging recklessly. By the time of the later empire, Germanic tribes were no longer the same warriors Rome had once crushed. They had grown more organized, more coordinated, and far more dangerous. A similar story unfolded with the Parthians and later the Sassanids in the east. Rome's encounters with Parthian horse archers revealed glaring weaknesses in the Roman system, as at the disaster of Carrhae in 53 BC. While Rome adapted by strengthening its cavalry and experimenting with new tactics, the Persians also learned from Rome. They saw how to integrate heavy infantry into their armies, how to construct siege engines, and how to use disciplined formations to complement their own cavalry strengths. The result was a constant arms race, with each side adapting to the other's methods. But Rome increasingly found itself facing enemies who no longer relied solely on their native traditions. They wielded knowledge forged in the crucible of Roman warfare itself. Even within Rome's own borders, rebellions bore the mark of Roman training. The most famous example was the revolt led by Spartacus in 73 BC. Though a gladiator and a slave, Spartacus had once served in the Roman army. His knowledge of discipline and tactics transformed a band of escaped slaves into a force capable of defeating multiple Roman legions in open battle. Though eventually crushed, the rebellion demonstrated a terrifying truth. Once Rome's methods were in the hands of others, even the unlikeliest groups could become formidable threats. Another striking example came centuries later with the Visigoths. Initially refugees within the empire, the Visigoths were mistreated and forced to fight as auxiliaries. But years of service had taught them Rome's methods, from battlefield discipline to siegecraft. When they eventually turned against the empire, they used these very skills to stunning effect. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Goths inflicted one of the worst defeats in Roman history, annihilating an imperial army and killing Emperor Valens. The victory was not won by chance. It was the product of decades of exposure to Roman training and tactics. The same pattern appeared across the empire. Enemies who once seemed primitive and unorganized began to use Roman weapons, Roman formations, and Roman strategies. The Celts, Iberians, Germans, and Goths did not remain static foes. They evolved, and Rome's own policies had accelerated that evolution. By recruiting, training, and equipping men from conquered peoples, Rome unintentionally ensured that its own methods would spread far beyond its control. This was the great irony of Rome's dominance. Its success created the conditions for its future struggles. The empire that had once relied on being the most disciplined and innovative power in the ancient world was now surrounded by enemies who had absorbed its lessons. No longer could Rome count on facing disorganized raiders or undisciplined masses. Instead, it found itself battling opponents who marched in formation, wielded weapons of Roman design, and fought with the confidence of men who knew Rome's strengths and its weaknesses, just as well as Rome itself. The empire's enemies had, in effect, become Rome's students, and as history would show, some of these students would eventually surpass the master. For in its effort to control and expand, Rome had unknowingly created rivals who had been sharpened by Rome's own blade. Each war fought, each auxiliary trained, each rebellion crushed, left behind fragments of Roman knowledge that, pieced together, formed the foundation for forces that would one day challenge and eventually topple the empire itself. By the later centuries of the empire, Rome's dependence on foreign recruits had grown so heavy that it began to reshape the very character of the Roman army. What had once been a proud citizen force, rooted in the traditions of the Republic, was now a patchwork of men drawn from every corner of the empire and even beyond its borders. On paper, this seemed like a triumph of Rome's system, proof that the empire could command loyalty from peoples far removed from Italy. But the reality was more complicated. As native Romans grew reluctant to serve in the legions, the burden of defense fell increasingly to outsiders who had not been raised with the same sense of devotion to the empire. This shift, though gradual, carried consequences that Rome could not easily reverse. The process began innocently enough. As Rome's territories expanded, the need for manpower exceeded what its citizen population could provide. Auxiliaries filled the gaps, serving in specialized roles like archers, cavalry, or slingers, and for centuries this arrangement worked well. But over time, the auxiliaries became more than a supplement. They became the backbone of the army itself. By the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, whole legions were composed largely of men whose ties to Rome were pragmatic rather than patriotic. They fought for pay, for plunder, or for the hope of citizenship. And while many fought bravely, their loyalty to Rome as an idea, as a cultural identity, was often shallow. This dependence opened the door for ambitious leaders to exploit the situation. Generals who commanded foreign troops could often inspire greater loyalty from their men than from Rome itself. Soldiers who shared common origins, be they Goths, Germans, or other tribes, often felt a stronger bond with each other than with the empire that paid them. When such troops were led by charismatic leaders, they could shift from defenders of Rome to threats against it almost overnight. The army, once Rome's greatest source of stability, increasingly became a force of uncertainty, as loyalty wavered between Rome and the men who held direct command. Moreover, the spread of Roman training meant that these foreign troops were no longer raw recruits. They were highly skilled, disciplined, and experienced in Roman methods. When loyal, they gave Rome strength, but when discontent or betrayal took hold, they became dangerous adversaries, perfectly capable of turning Rome's strategies against itself. The empire had armed its soldiers not only with weapons but with knowledge, and knowledge could not be controlled once given. The recruitment of entire tribes as federates in the late empire only deepened this vulnerability. Instead of individual men joining Roman legions, entire groups were settled within Roman territory under the agreement that they would provide military service. On the surface, this arrangement provided Rome with badly needed troops without the costs of constant recruitment. But in practice, it meant that large bodies of armed men lived inside the empire while still retaining their own customs, leaders, and loyalties. These federates were not truly Roman. They were guests with swords. Their presence blurred the line between ally and occupier, and Rome often found itself dependent on forces it could not fully command. The ultimate danger was revealed when these same federate groups turned against the empire. The Visigoths, once settled in Roman lands, rebelled when mistreated by corrupt officials. Their revolt culminated in the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, where an imperial army was destroyed and Emperor Valens was killed. The defeat shocked the Roman world, not simply because of the loss, but because of what it revealed. The empire's fate now rested in the hands of men who were not truly Roman. The system that had once been Rome's strength had become its most glaring weakness. From then on, Rome's reliance on foreign troops only deepened. Vandals, Huns, and other groups were brought into the empire as allies, but each carried the potential to become an enemy. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was less a state defended by its own people than a fragile coalition of hired swords, and when the payments faltered, or the promises of land went unfulfilled, these swords often turned against the empire they were meant to protect. This over-reliance revealed the true cost of Rome's strategy. By neglecting the cultivation of its own citizen army, the empire had allowed itself to grow dependent on outsiders whose loyalty could never be guaranteed. The same process that had once allowed Rome to conquer the world now left it vulnerable to the very people it had trained and armed. The empire's strength had become its undoing, as the tools it had spread across its borders were eventually used to dismantle the very walls of Rome itself. By the twilight of the empire, the pattern that had once seemed like a clever solution had become an unavoidable trap. Rome had built its strength by absorbing others into its ranks, teaching them the arts of discipline, engineering, and war. This policy had served brilliantly when the empire was at its height, giving it a near-endless supply of soldiers and ensuring that Rome's methods spread across continents. But in its final centuries, the empire began to reap the darker harvest of this decision. The very skills that had once fueled Rome's triumphs now armed those who would bring it down. The most striking example of this came with the Visigoths. Once refugees seeking safety inside the empire, they had been recruited and trained by Rome. For years they fought as Roman soldiers, learning the organization of legions, the use of siege engines, and the discipline that had made Rome unstoppable. But when mistreated and starved by corrupt officials, their loyalty snapped. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Goths annihilated a Roman army and killed Emperor Valens. This was no ragged tribal uprising. It was a disciplined, coordinated army using methods honed in Roman service. The empire had, without realizing it, trained its own executioners. This was not an isolated incident. Again and again, the enemies who posed the greatest danger to Rome were not strangers to its system, but products of it. The Vandals, once auxiliaries, turned their blades against Rome and eventually seized North Africa, the empire's breadbasket. The Huns, though never fully absorbed, fought alongside Rome at times, and the experience sharpened their ability to terrorize the empire's borders. Even the Ostrogoths and later the Lombards, who would carve their kingdoms from Rome's ruins, had long histories of contact with the empire, serving in its armies, observing its strategies, and adapting its tactics for their own ends. The lesson was clear. Knowledge once shared could not be reclaimed. Rome's military techniques, its methods of building camps, constructing roads, and maintaining supply lines, had spread far beyond Italy. Former auxiliaries returned to their people not just as veterans but as teachers, men who could show others how to resist the legions. The same gladius and pilum that had once been symbols of Roman dominance were now turned against the empire, wielded by hands trained under Rome's own banners. By the 5th century, the consequences were undeniable. The Western Roman Empire faced wave after wave of invasions, not from disorganized raiders, but from entire peoples who fought with skill, coordination, and purpose. These groups did not strike blindly. They targeted Rome's weaknesses, exploited its stretched supply lines, and pressed into its heartlands with strategies that mirrored the empire's own. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric, a leader who had once served in Roman armies. The Eternal City, which had stood as the symbol of Roman power for centuries, now fell victim to men who had been, in many ways, Rome's students. Even as the empire staggered, it could not escape the system it had created. The reliance on federate troops, whole tribes settled within the empire in exchange for military service, only deepened the problem. These groups were expected to defend Rome, but they often acted as independent powers, negotiating with the empire as equals rather than subjects. When their demands were not met, they no longer hesitated to seize what they wanted by force. The Vandals, settled at first within the empire, crossed into Africa and seized Carthage, cutting off Rome's lifeline of grain. The Western Empire, once fed by the wealth of its provinces, now starved at the hands of those it had armed and trained. The fall of the Western Empire in 476 AD was not a sudden collapse, but the inevitable result of centuries of decisions that had sown the seeds of weakness. Rome had conquered through integration, but in doing so it had spread its own power too widely. What began as a strategy to strengthen the empire ended as the very reason for its undoing. The barbarians who dismantled Rome were not outsiders in the truest sense. They were Rome's former soldiers, Rome's former allies, Rome's former auxiliaries. They were, in effect, Rome's shadow, carrying forward the knowledge of the empire even as they tore it down. In the end, this was the great irony of Roman history. The empire that had prided itself on teaching civilization to the world had also taught the world how to defeat it. Rome had believed it could mold outsiders into loyal servants, but those outsiders became something far more dangerous, capable rivals. And when the final blow came, it was delivered not by a mysterious enemy from beyond the horizon, but by men who had once marched under Rome's own standards. The teacher of nations had become the architect of its own downfall. Rome's story is often told as one of endless conquest and unmatched strength, but its decline reveals a truth that is far more complex. In its pursuit of power, Rome opened its ranks to outsiders, shared its weapons, its tactics, and its discipline, believing these gifts would ensure loyalty and secure the empire's future. For centuries, this strategy seemed to work. Rome grew stronger, larger, and more formidable than any rival. Yet beneath this triumph lay the seeds of its undoing. The auxiliaries and federates who once fought for Rome carried its knowledge back to their people. Former enemies returned as seasoned veterans, teaching their tribes how to stand in formation, how to build siege machines, and how to resist the legions with the very discipline Rome had instilled in them. By arming the world with its methods, Rome had unknowingly built the foundation for its own downfall. When the final blows came, they were not struck by strangers from distant lands, but by men who had once marched under Roman banners. The Goths, Vandals, and countless others were Rome's students and, in time, its conquerors. The irony of history is that Rome's greatest strength, its ability to absorb, adapt, and teach, was also the cause of its end. The empire that believed it was shaping the world was, in truth, shaping the very forces that would destroy it. Rome did not fall to chaos or chance. It fell to the shadow of its own making,